Our next presenter, our featured presenter today, is Dr. DeMuro, and she is going to talk to us about research, but what is meaningful research participation? Here at the Goizueta Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, we conduct healthy aging research. We do research on Alzheimer's and related dementias, and we're focused right now on determining what is it that we can do that makes dementia of any kind less likely as we age. And because we're looking at what makes dementia less likely, we want to participate in research that's going to make a difference to us. And that's what Ms. DeMuro is going to talk to us about. So at this time, I'd like to present Ms. DeMuro, Ms. Carla DeMuro.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation today, Dr. Parker, and this whole group. I really appreciate it. And I just have to say, I loved that exercise introduction. I've been stuck at my desk since early this morning, so I feel so much more energized. That was fantastic. It's a good reminder to get up and move. I think it also helps our brains to move. So hopefully I can bring some of the energy from what we just saw into this presentation and what I have to share with you today. So these are the topics that I plan to cover. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the What Matters Most research initiatives that we've been conducting, bring you a status update on all of the research that we've conducted to date. I'm going to be talking about a series of studies that we've been conducting over the last 5 years, give you some information on that, and then give you some information if you'd like to get involved yourselves in this research opportunity, how you might do so. And then I'll try to make sure that I leave some time at the end to answer any questions or follow-up that you might have for me. Go to the next slide. So the What Matters Most series, again, it's a series of studies that they are sponsored by ADPACE. ADPACE is the Alzheimer's Patient and Caregiver Engagement Initiative. It is a public and private consortia that is made up of individuals who are care partners of someone living with disease, persons living with disease, as well as U.S. regulators in the FDA, pharmaceutical team clinicians and members who work in research at the pharmaceutical team level, as well as folks who work in helping to make payer determinations, so whether or not a product is going to be able to be covered and paid for once it's out in the marketplace. So this is a multi-level, non-competitive consortia group. So folks coming together across multiple pharmaceutical companies, coming together with regulators, persons living with disease, and their care partners to try to really drill down and understand what it is that is wanted and needed by those living with this disease and those care partners. What are the treatment needs and desires? What are the unmet needs that need to be met? So this is a multi-phased study. I'll talk to you about the research that we've conducted to date and the research that's currently ongoing, as well as what's ahead of us. And love to take your questions about this as we move along. I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, these are our team members from RTI. We are a not-for-profit research entity. We're based in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is a very large team, as you can see. I'm Carla up here in the corner, and then these additional folks are members of my team, who include folks who work with me in the patient-centered outcomes assessment team here at RTI. We have health economists, we have health preference workers, psychometricians, as well as survey methodologists and other researchers, all contributing to this effort. If we go to the next slide, it's the leadership of our ADPACE. This was started by George Regenberg and Meryl Comer some years ago when they developed the Us Against Alzheimer's. ADPACE is a sister organization of Us Against Alzheimer's. And most importantly, we have lived experience leaders who are informing our research, and they're included here. Doreen is currently living with Alzheimer's disease, and her perspectives are super interesting as a neuroscience nurse. Lee Callahan, who is a UNC professor and also a former care partner of someone living with disease. Jim Taylor and his wife, Jerry. Sadly, we lost Jerry it's about a month or so ago now due to complications of Alzheimer's disease, but she was in it to the end, really making sure that her perspectives were brought forward in the research, and attended every meeting, and was a cherished member of the ADPACE team we'll always miss. Her husband, Jim, was her care partner, and he is also a wonderful advocate for those living with disease. If you've heard of Voices of Alzheimer's or the Alzheimer's Disease Patient Bill of Rights, then you know about Jim and the work that he's continuing to carry on in Jerry's memory. And also our member, Ian Kremer, who is Executive Director of LEAD, another patient advocacy group for persons living with Alzheimer's disease. And you can see our sponsors at the bottom of that slide. We're pharmaceutical companies all contributing to this work in a pre-competitive space, meaning they're putting their own agendas aside to come together and work on Alzheimer's disease as a problem and not focused on single products that they're attempting to bring through. Okay, so I'm going to say something that's probably extremely obvious to all of you as care partners to someone living with this disease, but we often get the question, why, what matters most series of research, and why are we doing this at all? There's been a regulatory movement, for one, where we've gotten some support to be able to fund research like this called patient-focused drug development. And patient-focused drug development was born of the idea that we all know, if you've ever been a care partner, and I have, and I know that all of you have as well, that patients are experts in their own experience or disease or condition. So to develop treatments, therapies, or interventions without their voice is really quite meaningless. And it's also extremely difficult to test therapeutics without the patient's voice and their own experience or condition. They're the folks who are living with their conditions. Oh, we can go back one. Living with their conditions, and this information, when it's taken from patient to clinician, can help physicians, help patients to make better choices, what medications they wish to choose and interventions they wish to try. Additionally, we all know that we need medications to be funded and paid for by our insurance companies. Payers want to pay for medications that work and make patients feel better and function better. Regulators want to have medicines that matter to patients. And the way that we learn this is by having patient-focused drug development, talking to patients, presenting the opportunity for them to influence product development. We can go to the next. So part of that is all the background into the thinking of why we started the What Matters Most research program. And this work has been conducted so far in 2 rounds of research. I'll talk to you first about round 1. This is the work that we've completed to date. And then I'll talk to you about round 2, where we are about halfway completed. Within round 1, we first wanted to identify that patient experience, so the lived experience of Alzheimer's disease. So to do so, we conducted a qualitative study that included 60 persons living with Alzheimer's disease across the full spectrum. If you look at the bottom of our slide, you'll see that the way that we categorize participants in What Matters Most research is across these 5 different groups. This includes persons living with disease who are characterized at risk, so they might have specific AD pathology, so a biomarker of some type that indicates they are at high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, all the way through care partners of persons with moderate dementia or severe dementia. The first study we conducted was a qualitative study where we identified 42 outcomes that across the many different topics that we discussed with these participants that kind of bubbled to the top, and we labeled these as what matters most. So these are 42 signs, symptoms, or impacts or desired treatment outcomes that surfaced within our research. The next study that we conducted was a quantitative study where we really wanted to test out, were these 42 concepts that we identified in the qualitative research that the patient and care partner interviews, did they hold true in a larger study? And could we look at that mathematically? So we conducted our second quantitative study where we recruited an additional new sample of 274 persons living with disease and their care partners. We asked them to take an online survey where they rated these 42 concepts that we identified in the previous qualitative study to determine if these truly were the concepts that mattered most to those living with disease and their care partners. Interestingly, the results did hold up, and all of the 42 concepts that we included in the study were rated as very high to extremely important by all of the participants and the care partners. Importantly, though, we noticed some differences in the ratings when we compared persons living with disease and their care partners. And this became more true as we looked across the spectrum of disease. It really reminded us how important it is that we're capturing both perspectives whenever we can. So listening to and talking with the person living with disease, as well as understanding their perspectives of their care partners and making sure that both of those viewpoints are captured in research, and both of those are equally as important. Finally, we took those 42 concepts that we had tested both qualitatively in interviews and quantitatively in our survey study, and we looked at those concepts and mapped them, compared them to the clinical trial assessments. So questionnaires, studies, other evaluations that are routinely included in clinical trials for new therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease, and we mapped them. So we wanted to understand how well do the tools that we used in Alzheimer's disease research map back to what persons living with disease and their care partners care about, and looked at that mapping. And it's probably not terribly surprising to any of you that that mapping didn't go all that well. There were certainly some measures that are used in clinical trials that capture a lot of that information, and I'll show you in a slide or two what I mean more about that, but there are certainly gaps. So the tests and assessments that are included in clinical trials, while they may be very good at being sensitive to detecting treatment effects from the perspective of the clinician, those outcomes that they're measuring may not be the things that are most important to persons living with disease and their care partners. That has led us to our next round of research, so our round 2 research. So looking at those gaps. So we've identified these 42 concepts of interest. We have assess them both qualitatively and quantitatively. We map them across to the clinical trial instruments that are being used, and then we realize that we are left with more questions. And I'll talk to you about what those next research questions are in just slides. If we can go to the next slide, I want to show you some of the other outcomes from that round 1. So, taking that round 1 research, we decided that having the 42 concepts kind of abstract in a long list was less useful to us. We wanted to group those concepts into something that could be better understood, digested, and conceptualized by persons who are looking at our research, and also help us to use this then as a roadmap for designing future clinical studies. So the 42 concepts were analyzed by clinical researchers, experts in neuropsychology, to help determine where these 42 concepts that patients and caregivers told us about fall under major category headings. Those major category headings, or domains as we like to refer to them in our research, are listed here. So we see that we have concepts that fell under emotions, communication, social life and activities, thought processing, daily activities, and then this category that fell together under general independence. So, and we had one participant really clearly tell us that for her, this simply meant having enough independence to be able to take a walk on her own without having one of her grandchildren feeling like they needed to tag along, or another family member being worried that she wouldn't make it safe back from her walk. So these are the categories that have fallen here. And this is a very useful tool for us, because if you are designing a clinical trial and you have a new therapeutic that you think might impact one of these domains, it's useful then to go back to this and use it as a map to determine if the tools that you're using within your clinical trial are including concepts that matter most to persons living with disease. Go to the next slide. And this is a copy of a slide where we looked across at that mapping. So across the top, these are some very frequently used instruments or tests or questionnaires that are used in clinical trials of Alzheimer's disease. And then down the left-hand column are the concepts that were identified in our What Matters Most research. If there's green, it means there was an exact map from the concept that was identified in our research to one of these clinical trials. If there's yellow, there was something that meant it wasn't a direct match, but close. Where there is white space, it means there was no mapping whatsoever from the concept that matters most to the clinical trial instruments. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. So thank you for bringing up that concept in the chat about the diversity comment. That is absolutely our next goal. So the diversity in our sample of the round one research was just under 40% persons of color. Our research goal for round two is to include no less than 50% of participants of typically underrecognized and underrepresented populations. So I take your point, and that's actually one of the reasons that we're coming before you today to talk about that. So I'm going to go to the next slide. All right, so this is the work was completed. We're just under 40% of diversity included in this group. We wanted in our study sample, we were about 40% in the qualitative study and about 37 to 35%, depending on the group, for the quantitative study that we conducted to identify those 42 concepts. As we take your point, what matters most to whom, and making sure that these research findings are generalizable across all persons who live with disease. So this next study, we're focusing on making sure that we have no less than 50% diversity in our sample. Additionally, we're asking some other research questions. We feel comfortable that we've identified 42 concepts that hold true, meaning that they were qualitatively identified, quantitatively tested. And now we want to understand, as we increase the diversity of our sample, does that do those results carry true? And thank you for your questions about diversity. I have some slides that I'll show you, and I would love your feedback to make sure that we've done a good job at categorizing and classifying. And if we go back to the previous slide, the 42 concepts that we've identified, one more slide, are all here. And I know it's kind of small. We can make these slides bigger, but these are all of the different concepts that were identified. I don't know if there's a way to make it bigger on your screen or not. Early work that managing finances, et cetera, and ability to drive. And I'm happy to share these written slides with you as well. Okay, we can let's go ahead and move back, and I'm happy to come back and answer questions. I just saw this popping up, so I thought I'd address them as they came through. So we are here now. This is the work that's completed. What is in progress now is a larger quantitative study. So we're conducting a large scale survey. At this point of our recruitment, we're about 1/3 recruited, and 57% of the participants are persons of color. So we are making sure that we are over recruiting to make up for the lack of some diversity in our previous sample. We also want to make sure that we capture enough detail about each individual's participating in the survey from their racial and ethnic backgrounds so that we can make comparisons across groups. We want to determine if the priorities about what matters most are different among groups. First, we want to know of these 42 concepts, and I should tell you, when we did a second qualitative study where we had 51% diversity in that sample, we identified an additional 5 concepts, and we also took 3 of the original concepts and broke them into 2. So we were up to now 50 what matters most concepts. What we're focusing on now in our round 2 research is determining priorities among those concepts. So of those 42, what matters most of the important concepts in terms of treatment desires, preferences for treatments, concerns for signs, symptoms, and impacts of disease. We're using ranking methodology to take a look at that. The survey has also been translated into US Spanish as well to increase the accessibility of the survey to more persons. Once we have gathered these results, we will remap these prioritized elements of what matters most to clinical trial assessment measures, again, hoping to inform those who plan clinical trials so that they can incorporate and use tools that identify outcomes, endpoints, and information that are useful to those who are making decisions about whether or not they are going to take a medication themselves, or whether or not they're going to support their idea that their care partner should be trying this medication. Also important to us is dissemination of our study results. So making sure that the reports, abstracts, manuscripts, everything is put out into the literature, and also providing layperson communication so that everything that we write isn't just suitable for a medical journal, but for those who do not work in research and who are not clinicians or scientists, making sure that the results of our research are accessible to everyone. Go to the next slide. I share with you just a couple of quotes from some of our interviews, our qualitative studies. I have to say, this first quote that I'm sharing, I was really struck with, because it really demonstrated for me kind of the sophistication of those who are participating in Alzheimer's disease research, knowing the state of the scientists, knowing that there are blood tests and plasma biomarkers that are coming available, that are mostly just for research now, that will be available in primary practice for being able to identify whether or not you're at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So I thought this was an interesting quote, where the participant told us, "I'm a patient with unimpaired cognition was evidence of Alzheimer's disease pathology." So talking about how she had concerns that she was at risk. She's a caregiver for someone living with Alzheimer's disease and was worried about her own brain health. And then some others just talking about things that I think will probably seem familiar to you. So concerns about losing train of thought and ability to communicate, concerns about making sure that you're just taking care of your own household and doing things that the way that they need to be done. And then having a sense of just whether or not you're as sharp as you used to be, and whether or not you're feeling foggy and brain fog and other concerns. And then something else we thought was important, where we hear a lot about, is having good days and bad days. So some days when things seem much better, and other days when things seem much worse, and being able to recognize that and live through that with the person for whom you're providing care. Okay, so again, back to our expanded research goals. So increased diversity and inclusivity. Our current study is double the size of our last one. We're hoping to recruit a total of 600 persons living with disease and their care partners. We will include about 120 participants per AD group that I showed you early on, remembering that that is from persons who are at high risk for disease through care partners of persons near Alzheimer's disease. We're including a very detailed screening. We want to capture race, ethnicity, and acculturation. We want to be able to tease apart the way the lived experience may or may not be different based on your racial and ethnic background, and your home life, and the language that you speak at home, and your own cultural norms. We want to make sure that when we're talking about what matters most, that we know who we're talking about, who's contributed to this research, that we're able to describe them and characterize them appropriately, and make sure that we are gathering this research and making sure that it is truly inclusive and diverse as it need be. We want to be able to have a large enough sample so that we can mathematically look at these between group comparisons, and we want to have enough rigor in our research so that we can map this back to the FDA and their guidance and the way that they stage Alzheimer's disease research. Go to the next. Going to this slide, I think I don't have to tell you how important this is, that there'll be diversity in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials, and why that is so important. I include this here just to let you know that this was a big part of our research and our planning and the way that we wrote our study protocols, and it is the focus of the current What Matters Most research effort right now. Go to the next slide. This is some of the screening. So you may take surveys where you're asked to determine and choose how you self-identify. So choosing a race or ethnicity. So this is probably looks pretty standard to you, but what I think is different about the What Matters Most research is we have detailed categories. So if you skip to the next slide, I can show you an example. If you selected Hispanic, we drilled down to determine exact ethnic and racial categories. So where do your ancestors come from? What describes you? And we think this is really important. And I'll use my own family life as a situation. My daughter is half Cuban. because she's raised in an area where that while she's very close with the Cuban side of her family, she went to a high school that had limited diversity. We live in a rural area. So when she thinks about herself and self-identifies, some of the cultural norms that she thinks about come from her Cuban grandparents and that side of her family, and others come from what she experiences as being born in the U.S. and being raised in a high school and school that had very limited diversity, and whether or not she felt like this part of her culture was really recognized or even included as part of her formal education. But I will tell you that the way she thinks about health and the way she thinks about family is related to her Cuban ancestry and Cuban descent, where it's normal on that side of her family for large families to live together, and it's not an odd thing for grandparents to be living with their adult children and having grandchildren household. All of those things, I think, speak to about what matters most. And it also, I think, can speak to and influence the way folks seek care. Thinking again about my own family as an example, because of, on the Cuban side, the desire to take care of each other because families live together, it isn't until someone is pretty sick that they actually go to see a doctor. So early indicators of brain health concerns aren't brought to the attention of a healthcare professional. They're taken care of at home. And so often in the Cuban community around us, it isn't until someone is pretty far down the road and has pretty far advanced Alzheimer's disease that they start getting care. So these are the things that we need to identify by being able to talk about diversity. What are the cultural norms? How can we provide materials and understand what matters most within these specific cultural contexts within these types of studies? That's just one example I wanted to share. Go to the next. And so then we ask additional questions. So again, trying to get at how acculturation and how living in the US can start to change those cultural norms. What types of information do we need to provide? And what do we need to know about these participants so that we can understand and analyze the results of the survey? Go to the next. All right, this is just an advertisement. We are currently recruiting. If you or someone you know would like to be involved in this research, we would love to have you. We would like to know what matters most to you when you're thinking about Alzheimer's disease and brain health. This is me, and this is my email. This is my direct cell phone number. I'm one of those annoying people who always has her cell phone in her pocket. So if you call me and want to ask about the study, I will answer, and I'll be happy to tell you about our research. Cajun Nanasaki, he is our project manager. Cajun can be reached at his email address here. He was also extremely responsive. He will get back and answer any questions he can. And then finally, we have AD Pace, who is the sponsor of the study, and the A-List from Us Against Alzheimer's. This is a patient advocacy group that you're welcome to join, and Terry Frangioso would be more than happy to answer any questions. And because we have to be modern, we have a QR code here. If you scan it, that will take you to this information as well and tell you about the What Matters Most research and give you an opportunity to reach out to us.
Thank you so much, Ms. DeMuro. I have a question. This is Dr. Parker. What matters most to caregivers or persons who are worried about Alzheimer's? Once you get all this data, are you sharing this with whom? So we're a research center here at Emory. Are you giving this to academic researchers to help them guide the type of research that they're going to do into Alzheimer's? Are you giving this to the pharma manufacturers to help them design products with these thoughts in mind?
Yes, yes, and yes. So I think I have some slides on the end that show some of the publications. So we're definitely, out here in the medical literature. So you can find us in journals. I didn't include all of the posters. I think we have more than 6 or 8 posters that we present at conferences. We have done other public webinars where we have shared the disease model that I showed to you, and I'm happy to share any and all of this information with all of you. We will continue with our publication plan. We feel like if we're going to do this research, we don't want to do research that's not worth publishing, and we want to have the feedback back to the person who are participating with us. So we publish wherever and whenever we can. we're happy to do other webinars like this, and we've done some others to try to get the word out there and share this information. And I think it's critically important that this information go back to the pharmaceutical companies, the drug manufacturers, so they design trials thinking about persons living with disease, being patient-centric, and then feeding this back to FDA. So when they're making decisions about approving drugs, understanding how the drugs are impacting how patients feel, function, and survive following an intervention.
So in your research thus far, what are some of the things that family care partners want researchers to know about research? What are the things that stand out most for what I'm going to say we care about? Because most of our audience on BrainTalk Live, they're non-professionals from a healthcare perspective, but they are worried about, they may be taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's. They may be healthy and they want to stay healthy, but what are the concerns that come most up, come forward most
Yeah,
for persons living with dementia and their families in
yeah.
terms of research?
Yeah, so certainly with the what matters most, we can even skip back to that model slide if you want to early on, so that this can help distill it down. But I think what I would like to talk about for a moment is the fact that there are differences between persons living with disease and what matters most to them as individuals and care partners. And care partners do just an amazing job of providing care and trying to do all they can for the person who's living with this disease. So there are safety concerns, right? As you move along the continuum of disease, how do I keep my person safe, and being able to still have a life that feels meaningful? And that's something that we hear from the person living with disease. They need to be able to still find the meaning and feel like they're able to contribute. Having relationships with friends and family and social aspects are important. But certainly differences there where we see between the person living with disease and then the care partner. So the care partner may not mind that the person needs help, for example, taking their medications or organizing their finances. The person with disease, they mind very much because they're used to making their own decisions. So make sure that we balance out those wishes and desires and make those comparisons. Very important. I don't know if that helps answer that question.
It does. It does. I just, you included a lot of phrases and words that are really well known to those of us who are in research, but may not be as well known to people who aren't in research, but want to participate in some way. So a meaningful way, how about that? Make a contribution to the scientific research. And what you're describing sounds a little bit more like social behavioral research. Let's see, I can't really see the Q&As as well. So let me see what they've got in here.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So I think that what matters most in regard to treatment preferences, wants, desires, and needs is sort of beyond social and behavioral, but kind of is information that FDA needs to understand, clinicians conducting clinical trials need to understand, so that at the end of the day, we can translate clinical research into terms of treatment impacts that will matter to those who are on the receiving end of treatment.
Can somebody help identify some other questions that are in here? I can't see all of them on my device.
Yeah, they're asking about the timeline when the blood test would be available for primary care. Can you answer that?
Maybe Dr. Parker might have more information than I do there. I do know that the plasma blood-based biomarkers are used in research. I don't know the timeline for when it will be part of primary care, but I know that from attending the Alzheimer's disease meetings that it seems like we're getting close. And Dr. Parker, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how close you think we are to that.
Well, I think that while blood-based biomarkers have been developed and while they are in use in research, they have not been universally been approved by FDA. our insurance companies for use and treatment by primary care physicians like myself. I can probably order a blood biomarker test, but your insurance may not pay for it. So I think there's a combination of things that needs to take place, but have not yet taken place, such that blood biomarkers, while they are tools that can be used in diagnosing the disorder, it's not clear how they're going to be paid for, when they're going to be paid for, and the best practice or use of them. Just because you get a blood biomarker that is positive or negative doesn't mean that you won't get some aspect of this disorder. So we're still working on it, but right now blood biomarkers do look like great diagnostic tools. They're certainly less expensive and less invasive than having a lumbar puncture and neuropsychiatric tests and a lot of other things. But that's, for the time being, we still have to have, we're still using cerebrospinal fluid biomarkers for diagnosing Alzheimer's, or the PET and tau PET brain scans for definitively diagnosing Alzheimer's. Those are still in play. Blood-based biomarkers are still not universally used outside of research. I don't know what that timeline is. Some of the advocacy groups in politics can probably help us with that, but in order for them to be used universally, there has to be payment and agreement that these are okay to be used for this purpose.
Thank you. That was very helpful for me as well. Thank you.
And Dr. Parker, these are mostly comments. If Ms. DeMuro is okay with us converting her PowerPoint to a PDF and posting it to the attendees after we get the recording uploaded to our YouTube channel, that will help. That way you can follow along again and review some of the content along with the slide deck.
Okay.
That would be great.
DeMuro?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. If you're reading and something comes up, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that I can.
Last question. Is there an article for our audience to read? And lastly, more information, I guess, again, the contact slide for getting involved in the research that you're doing right now, this next phase.
Yes, so the contact slide is at the end of the presentation here, so please feel free to use that, use the QR code to come back to us. We are working on some layperson summaries, and to your point, Dr. Parker, not everyone is in research, so we're trying to take some of those other medical literature publications we've created and create some lay summaries that will be available. I would expect they'll be available out on the ADPACE website as we're completing more phases of this research. We absolutely want this research to be as accessible as possible. The whole point of it.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. DeMuro, for joining us on BrainTalk Live and making us aware of what matters most in Alzheimer's research for patients living with dementia and their families. To